I'm Rich Dana, and I'm going to talk about my project, my book, my baby, the cheap copies. I've got a bunch of slides. I'm going to probably go through them kind of fast because I want there to be plenty of time for discussion. So if I'm going past something too quick or you have a question, please jump in. It's great if it can be more of a conversation, but I also want to respect everybody's time and make sure I don't take up the time at the end when I get to see what you guys are all working on. So I'm gonna tell you a little bit about the book, about the origins of the technology, and some of that kind of good stuff. Let's see. All right. I assume everybody's seeing the slides. That's the thing you always have to say at the beginning of a Zoom presentation. The book Cheap Copies came out of, actually came out of my master's thesis. At age 55, I decided to go back to graduate school. I'm here in Iowa City, Iowa, and I was asked to be a guest instructor at the University of Iowa Center for the Book. And I had so much fun. I was like, wow, I wonder if I could go here. So I did, and I got a dual degree in book arts and library science. And next month, I'll be starting at University of Iowa Special Collections as the organizer of the Sackner collection. Sorry, the Marvin and Ruth Sackner Archive of Concrete and Visual Poetry, which is one of the biggest collections of typewriter art and all that sort of good stuff in the world, actually. So for those of you in the Midwest, I would love it if you'd come out and check out some of that stuff. But anyway, all of this came together with my already huge interest in history and making zines and copier art. And so the result was my MFA thesis was a guide to Mimeograph, Hectograph, and spirit duplication, which are like the three main pre-Xerox copier technologies. After that, I decided that really what I needed to do was do a proof of concept. So I decided to print the book in the technologies that I described. So I did a Kickstarter and did 100 copies that were completely printed on Mimeograph, Hectograph, and spirit duplicators. And I got an amazing response. It was great. So I decided to do like a budget version with an inkjet printed interior and a silkscreen cover, and that went really well. And so I continued to do an inkjet version, and that's what Quimby's is carrying and is available now and is out there in the wild if you want to pick up a copy. But the important thing to understand is that all these things started, the zine started with the fanzine, and that came from the world of science fiction fandom. And the Hectograph, which is, well, I'll talk about what the Hectograph is in a minute, was the cheapest and easiest way for these young people to put out their own science fiction magazines that either had stories or commented on the pulps that they all loved and tried to emulate. And you can see that in the artwork. But the cool thing about them is they're totally psychedelic, because especially with the Hectograph, you only had the purples, yellows, reds. There were no blacks in Hectography, because it's all based on aniline dyes rather than inks. But you can still see in a lot of archives a lot of these early fanzines, and they're really pretty amazing. The Hectograph, for those of you who don't know, is just a tray of gelatin, glycerin, and other components depending on the brand. And you would draw with a aniline dye pencil or aniline dye ink, and you slap it down on the gelatin tray, and then you put your clean paper down after that, and it makes copies. It's miraculous. And school teachers, churches, all kinds of people use them to make like up to 40 copies or so before they start to be depleted. Oops, why is my slide not advancing? There we go. So yeah, that's just an illustration from the book of the process. You write, and it's right reading. You put it down on the tray, it's reversed, and then when you put your paper down, it's reversed again to be right reading again. Here's some commercial Hectograph workbooks, masters that teachers would use to do lessons. Later on, the spirit duplicator or ditto machine. Some of us got assignments on that. And I hate to correct you, Cynthia, but the purple is ditto, not Mimeo. I'm sorry. I have to nerd out there for just a moment, but we'll get to that. The spirit duplicator was like a mechanized version of the Hectograph, and that included the ditto machine that a lot of us, was sort of the generic name for it. It took the gelatin tray away and relied on these carbons. They look like carbon paper. A lot of you may have seen them if you are a person of the tattooed persuasion. They're still used heavily in the tattoo world for transferring images onto skin before it's tattooed. And the spirit duplicator works by wetting the paper with alcohol as it goes through. It presses together with the paper master, and voila, you have a copy. And I love this because apparently this woman loves her ditto machine so much she has to rub the copies on her arm. The point being obviously that there's no ink, right? They came out dry, and they were not messy. That was super important in the world of office copiers. And then the mimeograph is the third thing that the book talks about, and it's completely different. It has ink, and it relies on a paper stencil, and the ink is pressed through it, and it's really superior to these others in a lot of ways, in that you have a wide variety of colors, plus you can always add more ink and make more copies, so you're not, your master isn't depleted after 30 or 40 copies. And that works. There's just a diagram or sort of an illustration of, you use a stylus or a typewriter or something to pierce the master page, and then you push ink through it either with a brayer or on a mimeograph machine, and it's like silkscreen. It's also the predecessor to the risograph. So if you're a risograph user, it's basically an analog risograph machine. I started noticing a lot of connections between fandom and the avant-garde. So looking at like Russian Cubo-futurist stuff from after World War I, and the stuff that science fiction fans were making, there are a lot of like aesthetic similarities. And one of the things I've kind of been doing scholarship around now is looking for connections between those two worlds. A couple of my favorite fanzine makers on the left was Edith Ide, also known as Tigrina, who was an LA fanzine maker, and she was like an avowed Satanist, and she made her fanzines at the office at RKO Pictures, where she was a secretary, and her boss told her to always look busy, never be polishing her nails or reading a book, so she would crank out fanzines when she wasn't doing other work. And John Baltadonis on the right there, he was one of the early masters of the Hectograph when he was a teenager, and after serving in the South Pacific went on to be an illustrator. Here's some examples of some Dada and Futurist publications, not necessarily all Mimeo, but the two on the left are. And you can see how similar they are to zines. Hey, Mimeo dog, be quiet. William Everson, he put out the War Elegies on a mimeograph machine when he was interned as a conscientious objector in World War II in Waldport, Oregon. And you can see the sort of chapbook zine quality of what he did. And I really consider him one of the people who really sort of bridged the gap between the early beatniks and fandom as these people started to grow up and go off to college and get more serious about doing this stuff. But here's the damn thing from the same year. It's a fanzine, and it shows 3 science fiction fans being led off to conscientious objector camp. And you can see the one in the front, his tag says Bradbury. It's Ray Bradbury, who was, I think, 22 at that time. So, you know, the politics of the day appeared in different ways on both sides of the equation, both being printed on mimeograph machines and, you know, kind of sharing some aesthetic qualities. And then by 46, Edith Tigrina appeared again as Lisa Ben. And this time she was putting out America's first lesbian publication, Vice Versa, still putting it out on the office copier at RKO and distributing it through coffee shops where she played as a folk singer and bars around LA. And of course, this was a pretty risky proposition at that time because she could have been arrested, imprisoned, but Vice Versa survived, I think, 10 issues. So, and here's the first distributed edition of Howl by Allen Ginsberg, and you can see it was put out on a Ditto machine. D.A. Levy from Cleveland, he was a real master of the hectograph and really dreamed of making Cleveland a center of poetry, and unfortunately suffered a lot of persecution at the hands of the Cleveland police and took his own life at an early age, but not before putting out some really amazing stuff using the same jelly printing technique that the fanzine makers used. And Leroy Jones, also known as Amiri Baraka, he started out with a mimeograph machine. Here's some protest posters and a master for a Ditto printed coloring book from a number of different social justice organizations in the 60s. And the Diggers in San Francisco used, you see Jane Norling there using a electrostatic stencil cutter to make stencils that could be used for silkscreen or for mimeograph. So I set about doing cheap imitations of some of the stuff that I was seeing in my research, and trying to do it in the same way that the original creators did. So these are some of the pages from the original edition of the book, and they're reproduced in the inkjet version. On Guard, a 1946 science fiction fanzine, and on the right is my sort of riff on that. Explodity, this is a Russian Cubo-futurist thing by Olga Rozanova, and I reinterpreted it with the poem by Alexei Kruchenik on the right. Ed Sanders, his magazine was Fuck You, a Magazine of the Arts, one of my all-time faves. Here are a couple other illustrations produced by Hectograph on the left with black mimeograph type and the two-color Mimeo on the right of Leroy Jones and Diane DePrima, who put out the Floating Bear. The book's full of tips and tricks, and they're all heavily illustrated, and some of them are just little quickies like these, and the other chapters are complete step-by-step how-to things. And so that's that. I have a couple other things to share really quick. Just to help you understand how these things work. Here's a little video I did yesterday. I made a Hecto jelly, and I printed some little Zine Club flyers with it, and I'll show you how it works. Here we go. So I started out by just with a Sharpie drawing out the logo. I placed it over one of these Hecto carbon sheets. I had two. I had a purple and a blue, and I created a two-color master, and then I pressed it down into the gelatin tray and let it sit for a few minutes. In the old days, it used to be like you'd let it sit as long as it took to smoke a cigarette, I guess. And for some reason, I can't decide which way to put the paper on, and I finally do. And there you go. We can get about 40 or so copies. And depending on how long you leave it down, you can get a more vivid copy, but then you might get less copies. Sometimes I'll pull the first ones up quick, and then as it starts to get depleted, I'll leave them down longer and longer. But it's a very simple recipe. You can do, make it in your kitchen. And obviously I'm using a cookie sheet to do that. We've got a quick one of the Mimeograph. Some of you may remember the Mimeograph stencils. You'd type on them or draw on them, and it would punch through. And here it is on the machine. You get a close-up and you can see the ink is pressed through the letters. I also now use, because a lot of the original tools aren't available, I use a lot of different stuff for textures. Like here I'm using a drywall sanding screen. And if you don't have a machine, I also have a description of how old fanzine makers used to print with the Tin Can Wonder, which is basically a cylinder printer without a machine, just an old flannel shirt wrapped around a paint can. And I used it to do sort of a background texture before I printed my my text with the machine. So you can kind of see that that sanding screen texture. Then I stick them in the machine. I printed over the top of them to get a two-color copy. I printed some white ones too, just so you could see. Oh, it's a cursive typewriter too. But there you can kind of get an up close of the kind of textures that I got just using sandpaper. And there are all sorts of stencil, like modern stencils work. But there are tons of old lettering guides and stuff like that that are available out there. And the last thing I wanted to show you quickly was sort of where the project has gone since the book came out. So a couple of years ago, I came into possession of a really large collection of mimeograph machines that were gifted to me by a former, well, still science fiction fan and fanzine publisher, but as the older fanzine makers gave it up, they all started dropping their machines off on him, and he became the repository of all these. And then Erwin Block in the Netherlands called me and said, "Hey, are you close to Minnesota? Because there's this guy." And so I ended up driving up there and taking in all these machines. I've been fixing them up and trying to find homes for them with people who will use them and give them good homes. I've got several that are cleaned up in really good operating condition that I decided to take on the road this summer. And I drove to Texas, I drove to Minnesota, I even did a little jaunt around Europe with a little miniature setup in my suitcase with a Hectograph jelly and a flat plate like silkscreen rig for printing mimeograph masters. Oh, that looks terrible. But that's the Houston Printing History Museum and the Austin Center for Book Arts on the right. And I wanted you to see some of the stuff that people did after 1 or 2 days of playing around with the machines. That's the most important thing I wanted to share. So these are just illustrations of some of the stuff that I did or students did. And I think there's just some really amazing stuff that people were able to do after just a little bit of experimentation with the machines. And that's it. Okay. Well, thank you for indulging me in that. Hopefully it kind of illustrated where it came from, what's possible now, and why I'm so enthusiastic to get people trying this stuff out. So I'm anxious to hear what you all have to say.